Hello, everybody. I am the Warped Adventure, and today we're back with another deck talk. This time we're doing a deck talk on Rashmi and Ragavan, otherwise known as my Exiled deck. So, basically, the point of this deck is you just want to cast a lot of stuff in one turn, get a haste enabler out there, and have a massive board that you can swing with immediately. So, let's begin as we always do with the ramp. And as I've said many a times, start with the obvious ramp and work from there. So first things first, we have a soul ring. Yeah. A chromatic lantern. Since this is a green blue red deck, chromatic lantern helps a lot to color fix if we need it. Cultivate for some good old fashioned ramp. Terramorph for ramp and casting itself from exile for free, which this deck likes to do. It likes to cast from exile. Then Beanstalk Giant, and that way you can fetch a land early game, and later game you could cast it from exile to get a big creature out there. And it's again casting from exile. This deck likes to do that because just casting a thing from exile could give you a wolf or buff your stuff, or you can copy it if you cast it from exile, and then have fun. Next up, we got Venture Forth. That way you can suspend it, and this deck, I mean, it doesn't play with time counters a whole lot, but it has at least a way to play with them. Cost 4, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a land card, put it on the battlefield, and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Then exile Venture Forth with 3 time counters on it. And it has suspend 3, and so over time you remove those time counters, and when it hits the final one, you cast it for free again, and then it sets itself back onto suspend. And so just every 3 turns, more or less, you'll ramp yourself some, which is really nice. And you're casting it for Big Cell, like I've said many a times already. Stick likes to do that. Next up is Inga and Esika, one of my favorite ramp creatures. It's a 4/4 for 4. Creatures you control have vigilance, and they can tap to add 1 mana of any color. Spend it only to cast a creature spell. Whenever you cast a creature spell, if 3 or more mana from creatures were spent to cast it, draw a card. So it's a little bit of card draw when you need it. It turns all your creatures into mana creatures, so the more you cast, the more you can cast, which can get out of control really quick. And little bit of card draw to keep your hand full. It's nice and helpful. Next up, Circle of Dreams Druid. It's a 2/1 for 3 that tap to add 1 green for each creature you control. Pretty obvious. You see this in a lot of green decks, just because, I mean, green gets a decent amount of creatures and just ramp, ramp, ramp. Get out of control. Next up, we got Sarok's Tome, or Sarvok's Tome? I don't know. It's for an artifact. When it enters battlefield, you take the initiative. The initiative is just a dungeon that um, is the only way to venture into it is with the initiative. And as long as you have the initiative, you venture into it every upkeep, and whenever you venture into and whenever you take the initiative, you also venture in. Um, and if someone deals combat damage to you, they take the initiative. That it has tap, add a colorless. If you have the initiative, add 2 colorless instead. And you can pay 3 colors, tap it, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Activate only if you have completed a dungeon. So, it's really nice. It can ramp you when you need it, and when you complete the initiative, you can start casting stuff from the top for free. Keep in mind, those lands that you're exiling don't go back to the bottom, they stay in exile. So that could be an issue. Next up, Horizon Stone. If you would lose unspent mana, that mana becomes colorless instead. So it's a mana bank. You could tap all your mana, and it would fade away, instead it just turns into colorless mana, and so you could keep all your mana permanently, just as colorless. It's nice. Next up, Oblivion Sower. It's 6 cost for a 5/8. When you cast it, target opponent exiles the top 4 cards of his or her library. Then you may put any number of land cards that player owns from exile onto the battlefield under your control. The nice thing about that is if somebody else is also doing a lot of impulse draw and they have other lands in exile somehow, then you also get those lands too. It's not limited just to the lands it gets you off the top 4. So that's really nice. Next up, it's a single spot, but stuff that play with time counters. Alundo the Seer. He's 4 for a 3/5. You can tap him to draw a card, then exile a card from your hand and put a number of time counters on it equal to its mana value. It gains when the last time counter is removed from this card. If it's exiled, you may cast it without paying its mana cost. If you cast a creature spell this way, it gains haste until end of turn. Then remove a time counter from each other card you own in exile. So every time you throw something into exile with Alundo the Seer, all the other stuff you have in exile with time counters on them, you remove a time counter from each of them. And he's really nice. And that Adventure 4 thing that suspends itself every time it finishes its last time counter will also get its time counters removed from Alundo. So that's a lot of fun right there. Next up, we have Cascade Focus. First up, Shardless Agent, costs 3 for a 2/2 that has Cascade. Pretty clear. Next up, we have Flamekin Herald. 3 cost for a 3/2. Commander spells you cast have Cascade. Pretty nice. Next up is Wild Magic Sorcerer. 4 for a 4/3. The first spell you cast from exile each turn has Cascade. You got Bloodbraid Elf, 4 for a 3/2 haste. That also has Cascade. Aurora Phoenix, 6 for a 5/3 flying Cascade. Whenever you cast a spell with Cascade, return Aurora Phoenix from your graveyard to your hand. That one's pretty nice. Next up, we got Sweet Gum Recluse, 6 for a 0/3 flash Cascade Reach. When it enters the battlefield, put 3 1/1 counters on each of any number of target creatures that entered the battlefield this turn. That one's pretty nice. If you want, it doesn't have to be on your turn, so you can flash it in on somebody else's turn and buff their creatures if for some reason you feel like doing that. And finally, the old commander of this deck, Emoti, Celebrant of Bounty. 5 for 3/1 Cascade, and spells you cast with mana value 6 or greater have Cascade. Yeah, that's really nice. I guess I should start explaining the commander more in these videos. So, Rashmi and Ragavan is 4 for a 2/4. When you cast your first spell during each of your turns, exile the top card of target opponent's library and create a treasure token. Then you may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost if it's a spell with mana value less than the number of artifacts you control. If you don't cast it this way, you may cast it this turn. There's a decent amount of artifacts in here, but regardless of how many artifacts are in here, the main focus of it is it gives you a treasure and then it gives you access to another card you can cast, regardless of if you cast it for free or not. It's really nice. So next up we have like impulse draw and stuff like that. Stuff that you cast from exile that aren't Cascade. So first things first, we have Dance with Calamity. Costs 8 Shuffle your library, then as many times as you choose, exile the top card of your library. If the total mana value of the cards exiled this way is 13 or less, you may cast any number of spells from among those cards without paying their mana costs. So, it's a little bit of a gamble. You can keep exiling cards, and as long as they're under 13, you can cast them all for free. But if it hits above 13, they all stay in exile. So, yeah. Next up is Ignite the Future. 4. Exile the top 3 cards of your library until end of your next turn. You may play those cards. If this spell was cast from a graveyard, you may play the cards this way without paying their mana costs. Hence why its flashback cost is 8 instead of 4. Next up, we have Apex of Power. 10 mana for a sorcery. Exile the top 7 cards of your library. Till end of turn, you may cast non-land cards exiled this way. If this spell was cast from your hand, add 10 mana of any one color. So it can give you access to 7 new cards, and uh, it gives you a 10 mana to use in addition to the mana you already have. It's super helpful. It can give you access to a bunch of cards, and yeah. Next up, we have Valkut Exploration. 3 costs for an enchantment. Landfall. Whenever a land ETB is under your control, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. At the beginning of your end step, if there are cards exiled with Valakut Exploration, put them into their owner's graveyards. Then Valakut Exploration deals that much damage to each opponent. So yeah, the more lands you dump out during your turn, the more goes into exile. And however much you leave in exile with Valkut Exploration, they go to your graveyard, and then you shoot your opponents for that much. With this kind of deck, it's mainly just gonna be 1 damage if you leave it in exile, which is still nice. You're punching your opponents basically 1 each turn. Next up, we have Outpost Siege. Next up, we have Outpost Siege. Cost 4 for an enchantment. As it enters, choose Cons or Dragons. If you choose Cons, at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card until end of your turn. You may play it. And if you choose Dragons, whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, Outpost Siege deals 1 damage to any target. That one's nice. It just gives you access to an additional card you could play that turn. And it's from exile, so this deck likes to do that. Next up, we have Dream Pillager. 7 for 4/4 flying. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, exile that many cards from the top of your library. Until end of turn, you may cast spells from among those exiled cards. So, again, gives you access to a group of new cards to use, and it's a big old flyer, which is helpful. Next up, we have Intet the Dreamer. It's 6 for 6/6 flying. Whenever he deals combat damage to a player, you may pay 2 colors and a blue. If you do, exile the top card of your library face down. You may look at that card for as long as it remains exiled, and you may play that card without paying its mana cost for as long as Intet remains on the battlefield. So you punch someone and pay 3. It gives you access to a new card you could play, and yeah, could even if it's a land, it's still helpful because you could play it, not cast it. Next up, we have the Omen Machine. It's 6 colorless. Players can't draw cards. That's a big back. That's a big devastating thing. But at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player exiles the top card of his or her library. If it's a land card, that player puts it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, that player casts it without paying its mana cost if able. So basically, it's gonna give you free stuff on. It's gonna give everybody free stuff, and it's gonna stop everybody's absurd card draw. Just stops all card draw in general, but you can work around it because you impulse draw, you don't card draw. So you exile and play those cards rather than drawing cards into your hand. So there is a fair amount of card draw in here, but still, you have ways around it, whereas other people generally don't. Next up, we have the Temporal Anchor. 3 blue, 3 colorless for a legendary artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, scry 2. Whenever you choose to put one or more cards on the bottom of your library while scrying, exile that many cards from the bottom of your library. During your turn, you may play cards exiled with the Temporal Anchor. So on your upkeep, you always throw the cards to the bottom while scrying, and it gives you those cards to play, and you draw your card. So it's basically like getting 3 additional cards you can play, rather than just 1. But if it's like an instant that you want to be able to play on other people's turns, you gotta leave that on top. So only time you leave things on top while scrying with the Temporal Anchor out. Next up is Stolen Strategy. 5 it's a 5 cost enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of each opponent's library. Till end of turn, you may cast spells from among those exiled cards, and you may spend mana as though it were any color of mana to cast those spells. So, again, access to more cards and access to other people's cards rather than your own. And sometimes you have access to great cards. And finally, we have Atali Primal Storm. 6 for 6/6. Whenever Atali Primal Storm attacks, exile the top card of each player's library. Then you may cast any number of spells from among those cards without paying their mana costs. So basically, he's going to give you access to 4 free spells you can cast. Unless everybody hits a land, then you're sad. But regardless, that's again more more fun stuff to cast from exile. And when you don't have to pay for it, it's even better. Next up is the stuff that likes things being cast from exile. You got Faldorn, Dreadwolf Herald. 3/3 for 3. Whenever you cast a spell from exile or land enters the battlefield under your control from exile, create a 2/2 green wolf creature token. You can pay colorless, tap, discard a card to exile the top card of your library. You may play it this turn. So it gives you some payoff for casting spells from exile, so it can build up your board with a bunch of wolves while also building your board with all the spells you're casting. Next up is Tlinkali Hunter. 7 for a 7/7 trample. Once each turn, you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for a creature spell you cast from exile. And it has Retrieve Prey for 2. It's a sorcery on its adventure. Exile target creature card from your graveyard until end of your next turn. You may cast that card. So it's kind of a graveyard recursion, and if you cast Tlinkali Hunter the next turn, then you could cast the creature you got back from your graveyard for free on your turn. Kind of like casting 2 things for the cost of 1. It's really nice. Next up, we have Kami of Celebration. 5 for a 3/3. Whenever a modified creature you control attacks, exile a top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. And whenever you cast a spell from exile, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. So all the spells you're casting from exile is going to be buffing your creatures, and then you're going to be swinging with them to be able to play more things from exile to buff your stuff even more. It's going to be great. Then we have the 13th Doctor. 3 for a 2/2. She has Paradox, so whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, put a 1/1 counter on target creature. And she has Team TARDIS. At the beginning of your end step, untap each creature you control with a counter on it. Not a time counter. Sorry, untap each creature you control with a counter on it. Any counter. So she's gonna be buffing your creatures with 1/1 counters whenever you're casting those spells from exile, or if you cast your commander for that matter. And then on your end step, she'll untap all the creatures you got with counters on them, so you can keep your turn going on other people's turns. Then we got Nelfeshini. Nelfeshini? Now it's a beast demon. It's a 6/6. It's a 4/6. Sorry, it's a 4/6 for 6. It has flying. Whenever you cast a spell from exile, copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. If it's a permanent spell, the copy gains haste, and at the beginning of the end step, sacrifice this permanent. So basically, big scary demon copies your spells from exile, and it doesn't care if it's the first one; it will just always copy them. So that's a whole lot of value right there, and it's a big scary flyer. What's not to love? Next up, we have Conduit of Ruin. 6 for a 5/5. When you cast Conduit of Ruin, you may search your library for a colorless creature card with converted mana cost 7 or greater. Reveal it, shuffle your library, then put that card on top. The first creature spell you cast each turn costs 2 colorless less to cast. I will point out the only thing it can fetch with its cast ability is Platinum Angel. But still, that is a good card to fetch, so I leave it in there because it also cheapens the cost of first creature. So it's a decently big creature. It can fetch you Platinum Angel, which is one of your win cons, cheapens your creatures. It does a whole lot for you. Next up, we have kind of board wipes. You got Delayed Blast Fireball. If you cast it for 3, it deals 2 damage to each opponent and each creature they control. If it was cast from exile, instead you deal 5 damage to each opponent and each creature they control instead. And you can foretell it, and if you cast it foretold, it costs 6. So there you go. And then we got Invasion of Colossus. It's 4 for a siege with 4 defense counters. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. Its other side is Refraction Elemental. 4/4 as ward pay 2 life. And whenever you cast a spell, Refraction Elemental deals 2 damage to each opponent. So, yeah, that's pretty nice. With the amount of spells you cast, you're punching your opponents, could eventually just end the game. But it's also there so that way you can clean up the board before building your own board. Next up, we got the card draw. This first one's sort of removal as well, temporary removal. Extraordinary Journey. 2 blue and double X. When it enters battlefield, exile up to X target creatures. For each of those cards, its owner may play it for as long as it remains exiled. Whenever one or more non-token creatures enter the battlefield, if one or more of them entered from exile or was cast from exile, you draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. Not only could it be a removal, but it also could be a way to re-get your cast triggers or a way to re-get your enter the battlefield triggers. Or it could be a way to simply just get some of your stuff out of the way before you board wipe with your invasion of Karsus or something. You got choices. This one's not card draw, but it appreciates card draw. It's 3 for an enchantment called Words of Wilding. You may pay a colorless. The next time you draw a card this turn, put a 2/2 green bear creature token into play instead. Now, this one is in here as a sort of protection because Cascade decks are known to deck themselves kind of quickly, and this one is no different. This one decks itself in the late game quickly. So, having 2 different ways to not kill yourself from drawing too many cards is great. Words of Wilding can turn that card draw into creature tokens that you could swing with later, but mainly you just don't want to draw those cards. So getting something else from card draw is really nice. Next up, we have Battle Behemoth. 5 for a 6/5 trample. Whenever a permanent you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. And its foretell cost is 4. So it kind of incentivizes people to not touch your stuff because if they do, you're going to get some card draw from it. Which you do card draw just fine yourself, but if your opponents start messing with your stuff, who knows? It may incentivize them not to. Next up, we got Faithless Looting. 1 red, draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. If you and has flashback for 3. So you may cast it from your graveyard and do it again for 3. Really nice. Next up, we got Karuga the Macro Sage. 5/4 for 5. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card for each other permanent you control with converted mana cost 3 or greater. So it fills up your hand for casting a whole bunch of stuff or preparing yourself for the next turn. Generally, it's for casting a bunch of stuff in one turn. Then we got Shamantic Revelation. 5 for a sorcery. Draw a card for each creature you control. And it has Ferocious, so you gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. So it can fill up your hand, it can fill up your life total, and prepare you for an awesome turn. Then we got Garruk's Pack Leader, 5 for a 4/4. Whenever another creature with power 3 or greater ETBs under your control, you may draw a card. I love that it's a May ability. I love that it fills your hand for you playing your creatures. And, yeah. Again, card draw's nice. Not the focus of the deck, but still. Then we got Staff of Nin, 6 colorless for an artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card. Sorry. At the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card. And you can tap Staff of Nin to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. You can pick apart your opponent's boards, gives you extra card draw. You got a lot of nice stuff you could do with it. Or you could just simply poke your opponents over time. Next up, we have stuff that appreciate expensive stuff. So first off, Croson Drover. 4 cost for a 2/2. Creature spells you play with a converted mana cost 6 or more cost 2 colorless less to cast. It cheapens the mana cost of your expensive creatures so that way they aren't as expensive. And keeps your turn going. That's nice. Next up, we have Gandalf Westward Voyager. He costs 5 for a 5/5. Whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, each opponent reveals the top card of their library. If any of those spells share a card type with the spell you cast, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy, and each opponent draws a card. Otherwise, you draw a card. So there you go. It kind of sure you're copying your opponent's stuff, but then you're giving them card draw, and if you don't get anything from it, then you still draw a card. So he's really nice, and casting your expensive stuff to get other stuff possibly, or just to draw cards is really fun. Then we got the more control-y stuff. We got Green Slime, 3 cost 2/2 that has flash, and as foretell it costs 1 green foretold. When Green Slime enters the battlefield, counter target activated or triggered ability from an artifact or enchantment source. If a permanent ability is countered this way, destroy that permanent. And there you go. It can counter some scary ability that someone's about to get off, and it destroys that permanent as well. Next up, we have Beast Within. Yeah, it 3 mana destroying a permanent. They get a beast. Really nice. Then we have Counter Lash. Costs 2 blue and 4 colorless. Counter target spell. You may cast a non-land card in your hand that shares a card type with that spell without paying its mana cost. So, I think it's pretty clear why that's in here. a little bit of control, but also you're waiting to like counter their scary Atali, and then you cast your own Emoti Celebrant of Bounty for free, or your Nalfeshini or whatever. Next up, we have the uh, the more combo piece like stuff. So we have Intruder Alarm. 3 cost for an enchantment. Creatures don't untap during their controller's untap steps. Whenever a creature ETBs, untap all creatures. Yeah. This one is part of an almost infinite combo. Let me show you what I mean. Alright, so the combo with Intruder Alarm is you have Emoti Celebrant of Bounty out, so whenever you cast a spell with mana value 6 or greater, it has Cascade. Then you have Inga Nessica out and or Circle of Dreams threw it out. If you have them both out, that's all the better. And you have Group's Pack Leader out. So basically, let's say you cast Itali and you cascade into Stolen Strategy. In response to that, you tap all your creatures for blue mana. Then you tap Circle of Dreams Druid for a bunch of green mana. And then when Atali enters, they untap. So you have that mana floating. Then you get Stolen Strategy or something. And then Grook's Pack Leader draws you a card for when Atali enters. And Inca Nessica will draw you a card if you used enough creature mana. Then you maybe cast Platinum Angel and Cascade into Gandalf. And then you again tap all your creatures for mana with the then when the Platinum Angel enters, everything untaps. Then with this still on with this still on the stack, because this one would be cast first, you tap everything again for more mana, and then everything untaps. And if you have your Herbrask the Hidden out to give all your stuff haste, it's going to be game eventually because you're just going to get more and more and more and more mana because Circle of Dreams Druid and Inga Nessica, and you're going to be drawing at like 2 or 3 cards per every creature you play, and Gandalf's going to be copying them. And then even if you somehow run out of mana, you swing with Atali, run out of creatures to play. You swing with Atali to get access to more stuff and keep it going. After this deck gets going, it's unstoppable. Mm. All right. So yeah, Intruder Alarm is terrifying. Next up, we have the haste enablers, and speaking of the boy Urbrask the Hidden, we have Urbrask the Hidden. 5 for 4/4 that Phyrexian Praetor. Creatures you control have haste. Creatures your opponents control ETB tapped. So your opponent's stuff enters tapped. Your stuff has haste, and in this deck, haste is insanely helpful. So yeah. Then we have Sorok and Goreclaw. 6 for a 6/5 trample. Other creatures you control have trample, and whenever another non-token creature ETB is under your control, put a 1/1 counter on it, and it gains haste until end of turn. So having both these guys in here is really nice because Sorok and Goreclaw gives them all trample, and if you don't have Urbrask hidden, he's a decent stand-in because when something enters, you give it a 1/1 counter and haste, and it'll have trample. And yeah, start popping off immediately. And if you pop off enough, you could win immediately. Screw waiting a full rotation. We're doing it now. Do something about it. Next up, we have the big ol' stuff that you want to cast. Like they're amazing, but I don't really know where to put them. First up, we have Clone Legion. For each creature target player controls, create a token that's a copy of that creature. That's self-explanatory. Then we have Primeval Bounty. It's a 6 cost enchantment. Whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 3/3 beast. Whenever you cast a non creature spell, put 3/1/1 counters on target creature you control, and whenever a land ETB is under your control, you gain 3 life. Gains you life over time, buffs up your creatures over time, gives you creature tokens over time. It does everything for you. Next up, we got the cheaters. They're in every deck, and I love them. So first up, Vidal Ganori. You may cast spells as though they had flash. So you're gonna be casting all your stuff on your turn. Then when they untap on other people's turns, you start tapping your creatures for mana and cascading on their turn, and you can respond to people's removal to do it. It's basically at that point it's gotten unstoppable unless someone board wipes. Next up we got Bramble Familiar. 2 for 2/2 that taps for green, or you could pay 2 and tap it, discard a card to return Bramble Familiar to its owner's hand. And it has an adventure that's called Fetch Quest. It's ironic. Cost 7, mill 7 cards, then put a creature, enchantment, or land card from among the milled cards onto the battlefield. So yeah, you just play the fetch quest and you play Bramble Familiar, you cheat something out, you get Bramble Familiar back to hand, recast fetch quest, and yeah, you notice how the fetch quest is like you could do it over and over, and so the joke there is that fetch quests there's so many of them, and so yeah, it it's a stupid joke. I'm hilarious. You can laugh later. 3 for 1/3 haste. Is it Chemister? You can pay red, tap it, exile target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard. And then you can pay 2, tap him, sacrifice him. Cast any number of cards exiled with Is It Chemister without paying their mana costs. So over time, you're just going to start getting instant sorceries back from your graveyard. And then at some point, you can sacrifice them to cast all of them at once for free. Well, for 2, basically. Then the win cons, and then we'll move on to the fat stack of non-basic lands. Ley Line of Lightning. I consider this a win con, but it's not really a one-turn win con. It's only a one-turn win con if you have enough mana, which this deck generally will. Excuse me. First up, the Ley Line of Lightning costs 4 for an enchantment. If it's in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. Whenever you cast a spell, you may pay 1 colorless. If you do, Ley Line of Lightning deals 1 damage to target player or planeswalker. So you make your things cost an additional 1 if you want, and you can start punching people or planeswalkers. You can use it to take out planeswalkers too. Next up, we have Platinum Angel. 7 for a 4/4 flyer. You can't lose the game, and your opponents can't win the game. Pretty simple. I think that's obvious why it's a win con. Next up, we have Passionate Archaeologist. It's 2 cost legendary enchantment background. Commander creatures you own have, whenever you cast a spell from exile, this creature deals damage equal to that spell's mana value to target opponent. So yeah, fun little. Well, I don't really like it, but a note: if that creature has, if your commander somehow has infect, then a passionate archaeologist will be doing infect damage to them. So you know, that's kind of stupid. I don't like poison, but you could do that. But it's mainly in here because you cast a whole lot from exile if you haven't noticed somehow. Yeah, you cast a lot from exile and you start punching people over time, and in the late game you start doing all that in one turn, all the spells you're going to be casting, people are going to just start dropping because they won't have enough life to be able to withstand the amount of damage you're throwing at them. And then finally, a pretty clear game ender. End raise forerunners, and if you have if you have a Urbrask the Hidden out, it makes it even better. 8 for a 7/7 vigilance trample haste. When end raise forerunners enter the battlefield, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain vigilance and trample until end of turn. So you play it with Urbrask the Hidden out. All those creatures you just played get buffed with and get vigilance and trample, and they have haste. So you swing immediately for game, and if somehow somebody lives, they're all untapped because they have vigilance, and you're ready for the crackback. So yeah, we're moving on to non-basics. The amount of land I run in this deck is 37. Alright, and these are the non-basics I run. Sanctum of Ugin, cast color spell, and then you may sacrifice with mana value. Whenever you cast a color spell, convert a mana cost 7 or greater, you may sack this. If you do, fetch a colorless creature, reveal it, and put it to your hand. Cool. Highland Lakes, enters tap it for blue red. Game Trail, you may reveal a mountain or forest. If you do, enters untapped. If you don't, enters taps for red or green. Shimmering Grotto, taps for colorless. You may pay 1 colorless, tap it, add 1 mana of any color to mana pool. Is it Guildgate? Yep. Woodland Stream, enters taps for green or blue. Temple of Abandon, Yavimaya Coast. Cinderglade, counts as a mountain and a forest, and it taps for red or green, and enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basics. Seagate, enters, choose a color. When you tap this, you could add it for blue or 1 mana of the chosen color. You got Rural Guildgate, you got Exotic Orchard, that taps for any mana among that lands your opponent's control could produce. So, yeah. Then you got Frontier Bivouac, enters tapped, and it taps for green, blue, or red. Shrine of the Forsaken Gods, you could tap it for colorless, or you could tap it to add 2 colors, spend it only to cast colorless spells, and activate only if you have 7 or more lands. You got Vine Glimmer Snarl, it's the green-blue version of Game Trail. Simic Guildgate, and then you got Fungal Reaches. Taps for colorless, or you could pay colorless, tap it to put a storage counter on it. You can pay colorless and remove X storage counters from it to add X mana of any combination of red or green. Notably, you don't have to tap it to do that. You only need to pay a colorless. So, you could possibly tap this to pay for the colorless and then remove the storage counters. Or you could just have, yeah, there you go. And that is Rashmi and Ragavan. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, think about leaving a like and perhaps subscribe. And thank you for watching. This has been The Warped Adventure. Stay safe, stay healthy. Peace out.